We've talked about short chain fatty acids and fiber and bacteria. So I want to make sure, I know you guys are very sophisticated, but in case there's some of you out there who are a little new to the whole concept of the microbiome, let me go over just 3 simple definitions. The first is, what is a prebiotic? Prebiotics are basically dietary fiber. They're a type of specialized fiber that supports the beneficial microbes that live in your gut. Right. And there's very few bad types of fiber, except the fiber that comes out of the factory, the processed fiber. So whether it's artichokes or asparagus or broccoli or kale or spinach or, Brussels sprouts, whatever plant food like that you're eating, or oats. So that kind of dietary fiber is a prebiotic. And here I want to emphasize something. I want to tell you that a prebiotic from nature, an actual plant food that you eat, is always going to be superior to a supplement prebiotic. And I don't care what marketing they have on it and, blah, 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 eating the actual food. And I'm telling you, I've been a gastroenterologist for 30 years, and I have looked at thousands and thousands of colons and stomachs. And I'm here to tell you that the food is always going to be better than the supplement. No matter what fancy marketing rationale they tell you, well, the soil wasn't good and this wasn't good and that wasn't good, eat the food. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean a supplement may not play a role if you're low in some particular thing, but don't think that you can just take a prebiotic supplement while you are having your pizza and think that like, oh, good, I fed my bacteria. It does not work like that. Now, what is a probiotic? A probiotic is a live microorganism that, when ingested, confers a benefit to the host. That's the World Health Organization definition, right? Live bacteria organism that, when ingested, confers, and ingested could be by the mouth, it could be rectally with a stool transplant, confers a benefit. The confers a benefit part is tricky, and the live part is tricky, because what we see with a lot of these probiotics on the shelf is that A, the bacteria in them are dead, and B, they do not confer any benefit when you take them. Probiotics technically also refer to your own bacteria in your gut. But, in general parlance, when we refer to a probiotic, we typically mean an external thing that you take. Okay. So the prebiotic, the fiber, gets fermented by the probiotic, the bacteria, but really typically not the probiotic supplement you're taking, but the biotics, the biome, the microbes in your own gut. And they produced postbiotics. These short chain fatty acids we talked about, they're sometimes called a metabolic byproduct, but they are basically postbiotics. And again, short chain fatty acids are not the only postbiotics. It's referring to bacterial byproducts that affect a range of physiological processes, because what we've realized is it's not just what bacteria are growing, it's also what they're making, and that can change. So certain strains of bacteria can shift what they're metabolizing based on what you need, or, if it's something a little more pathogenic, they may be making something you don't need that's causing a problem. So understanding this whole concept of metabolomics, not just ours on a macro level, but the bacterial metabolomics on a micro level, is really important, because, for example, we see that sometimes the gut bacteria, even the good gut bacteria, are not making really significant amounts of short chain fatty acids. And we have to think of why that's happening, and why that's happening maybe because they don't have the substrate. So you may have lots of good bacteria, but the amount of prebiotic you're eating, the dietary fiber, is low. And so you're seeing a drop in the postbiotics, in the short chain fatty acids, et cetera. So just counting the bacteria alone doesn't give you the whole story, because again, you need to know, what's actually happening with the metabolic byproducts. All right. So here now I want to spend a minute telling you about my absolute favorite bacteria in all the world, and that's Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. We call F. prausnitzii. This is just a scanning electron microscope picture of it. F. prausnitzii has a protective role in metabolic diseases. So in things like heart disease and diabetes, et cetera, and in metabolic syndrome, that sort of compilation of lipid disorders and central adiposity, central obesity, that can lead to an increase in stroke and heart rates and a higher risk of dying. It is strongly correlated with short-chain fatty acid production. Why? Because F. prosnitzi is one of the bacteria that make short-chain fatty acids. It's more prevalent in vegans, no surprise there. And again, it's associated with a decreased risk of heart disease, of cancer, of diabetes, of obesity, and it has a protective role in COVID. And I'm going to tell you in a minute how that works. But I want you to remember F. prosnitzii, one of the good guys. Now I'm going to digress a little bit to talk about inflammatory bowel disease, just to give you enough background to explain some of the data from our practice. So inflammatory bowel disease is Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. They are familial diseases in the sense that there's a genetic predisposition sometimes in a minority of patients. With Crohn's, it's about 25% of patients. With ulcerative colitis, it's significantly less. And it involves dysregulation of the mucosal immune system. Remember, I showed you that diagram with the little, the gut lining and so on. So there's a dysregulation of what's going on there between the microbes and the immune system. And basically, the immune system is overreacting to normal commensal microbes. It's reacting to the healthy, regular bacteria in your gut as though it was an enemy, and it's making a reaction. And in this case, the reaction it's making are these ulcers, okay? The microbial signature in Crohn's disease, we see these microbial signatures in a lot of autoimmune diseases. And again, I don't want to oversimplify this and give you the impression that everything, you just have to eat some kale and all is well with you in the world. But because there are other factors, as I've said, there are environmental factors or genetic factors, et cetera. But what we know is that a lot of autoimmune diseases have these signatures. And with Crohn's disease, we see an increase in mucosal associated bacteria. We see a decrease, not surprisingly, in microbial diversity. And we see a decrease, again, here, no surprise, in production of butyrate, one of those really important short-chain fatty acids. So we know diversity is down, production of short-chain fatty acids is down, and then we see low Faecalibacterium. No surprise there. I told you that was one of the good guys. And we see an increase in some of the invasive E. coli. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is set the stage for you with this as an inflammatory condition that has its root in microbial imbalance. Okay, so this was a study that we presented at our International GI Conference, Digestive Disease Week, a little less than 10 years ago. It was myself and Jenna Hamshaw, who was a dietitian who was working with me at the time, a nutritionist, and who, by the way, has a couple great books out there. If you're interested, she does. I do too, but she does also. So this was a retrospective review to assess the effectiveness of a modified specific carbohydrate diet in improving quality of life and reducing frequency and severity of flare-ups in patients with inflammatory bowel disease, IBD. Now, I want to be clear, SCD, specific carbohydrate diet, is not a diet that I use in my patients typically, but this was a retrospective review. It's a common and popular diet for inflammatory bowel disease. And the reason I don't typically use it is sort of a modified third cousin of a paleo diet, which can be a very low fiber diet. But these were patients who were coming in on this diet and saying that their disease was better. So we said, okay, let's take a look at what they're doing and what they're eating and see what's going on. And these diets are these diets don't have like a cutoff grams of fiber amount or grams of carbohydrates, like in Atkins or South Beach, where there's a certain typically level of carbohydrates that they want you to stay below. These diets are more qualitative than quantitative, but they do exclude certain food groups. And some of the food groups they exclude, like gluten and processed carbs and sugars, can be helpful, but they can sometimes also limit fibrous foods depending on how you interpret them. So let's take a look at what these patients were doing. The age range, there were 12 patients, 9 female, 3 male. Mean age was 39.25, 9 had Crohn's, 3 had ulcerative colitis. The mean amount of disease was 10 years, but there was a range, 2 to 23. And this one is important, the past surgery. Almost half the patients had had previous surgery. And that's important because that's a marker for more severe disease. So these weren't people with, mild occasional symptoms. These were people with serious disease. The time on diet before improvement varied a lot. This is a time on diet in days, but really around 60 days. By 2 months, if you hadn't responded, and this is how I use as a guide in my practice. So my sweet spot in my practice is nutritional therapy for patients with complicated autoimmune disease like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And when I give them the dietary guidelines, I will tell them, like, look, hit this hard for the first couple months, because it's important for us to know. It doesn't mean you have to stay on this strict a diet forever, but I want you to hit it hard so that at the end of 60 days, we can see if you've had no improvement at all, then it is unlikely by that point that your disease is going to be responsive to just diet alone. It doesn't mean you should stop the diet, but it means that we may need to use some more conventional medications too. And so some of this information we know from this study. So mean time on diet before improvement, 38 days. But again, 60 days was sort of, where we saw most people having significant changes. The number of patients who were able to stop or decrease medication was 7 out of 12. Number of patients able to stop completely was almost half, 5 out of 12, and 2 out of 12 were able to decrease. And again, these are not medications like aminosalicylic acid medications that are pretty benign. These are patients who are on biologics and steroids, so serious immune modulating drugs. This is an example of a before and after. This is somebody's colonoscopy here. I mean, you don't have to be a gastroenterologist to see these deep ulcers and inflammation, and this is what it looked like after. Normal. So our endoscopic results, we did colonoscopy in 8 out of the 12 patients, 6 out of the 8 showed mucosal healing. And so we were able to conclude that nutritional therapy is a viable therapeutic option for management of inflammatory bowel disease. It can result in improvement of symptoms, it can result in mucosal healing, and it can result in a reduction or discontinuation of medication. The most important thing about this study, what it taught us when we really dove deep into what people were eating and had them bring in their food journals. Actually, I was just having people take pictures of the food because I found that was easier for people than a food journal. So I just have them take their phone, and every time they ate something, they'd take a picture, and then they would just send me the photos. And so we saw there was a crystal clear direct correlation between improvement and the amount of dietary fiber consumed. So people who were interpreting this diet as, I'm going to have bacon and eggs for breakfast, I'm going to have chicken for dinner, for lunch, and I'm going to have steak for dinner with a few broccoli florets, no bueno. Those patients were not doing well. It was the patients who were really ramping up their dietary fiber. And when there's active inflammation in the gut, that can be tricky. So we use a lot of green smoothies to blend the fiber. We use a lot of soups. We do a lot of legumes in a pureed form to get the fiber in a way that's a little less abrasive to the gut in our patients with active inflammation. And we also have a phase 1 and a phase 2. And in the phase 1, we have to go much more slowly with the fiber. And when people are in active flare-ups, and then as their disease quiets down, we can generally ramp up the fiber. So I just also, if there are any of you out there with inflammatory bowel disease, want to be clear that we don't introduce, 80 grams of fiber into an inflamed colon. That typically is not going to go well.